Fine. We'll get started here in just a second. It's 8:03 here in Austin, Texas, so I think we'll get started this morning. Brett, do I need to do anything to start the recording, or is that in your control?
We are good, and we are
Okay,
being recorded.
sounds good. Thanks, Brett. Okay, let's see here, folks. See if we can get this thing rolling. If I can figure it all out. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what I thought I would do in this very initial tech talk for EdgeX is try to start with the real basics here. So we'll take a look today at what you need to install, how you need to go about getting EdgeX code from GitHub, and then what you need to get in order to start working with EdgeX code and doing some development. We'll also look at how you set up the database, running the applications from inside of Eclipse and then working with that database. And then also talk a little bit about maybe some future topics that you all would like to have covered. And as always, what we'll use this session for is to separate it in kind of halves. The first half will be my presenting some information to you, or one of the disciples out of the Dell shop who helped to create EdgeX. And then the other half of the session will be for you to ask any question you'd like, really a Q&A on EdgeX in general. We're going to try to keep this technically focused, so if you do have things like marketing questions and such, I'll ask you to address those in some of the other forums that are out there. But if there's a technical question around EdgeX that you just can't seem to get answered, or you have a burning desire to get it answered during these sessions, then by all means bring it to our Thursday shops, and we'll do our best to try and answer that. Okay. So let's dig into things here, folks. And first of all, just as kind of an introduction, again, my name is Jim White. I work for Dell, distinguished engineer and one of our software architects. I work in the CTO office, the Chief Technology Office of the end user computing area of Dell. Dell, as many of you probably are aware, is a pretty big organization, so we actually don't have just one CTO office, we have several. I work for one that is responsible for things like your desktops, your laptops, tablets, and also our IoT gateways and products. And that's where I started with regard to IoT and this endeavor called EdgeX. I was the chief architect and lead developer of an internally codenamed project called Fuse. I was a developer of line number 1 and many lines thereafter. So if there's somebody to blame, if you really want to yell at somebody when you're trying to work on EdgeX code late at night, I'm the guy you can swear at. Fuse became EdgeX Foundry, or I should say a large portion of Fuse became EdgeX Foundry, and that which we'll start to discuss today. My email address is there on the screen as well. Be a little bit careful. Dell is a large company again, and there are many Jim Whites. So if you send it to Jim White, if you send it to James White, it probably won't get to me. It's got to be to jameswhite2@dell.com. I'll have that email address up later on today as well. Our tech talk, as I mentioned, we want to try and provide some community background on our system, provide you as much information as we can about the current system. The technical steering committee has been meeting for the last week or so and is discussing roadmaps and where we go and all the things we want to try and get done as part of some of the first releases and some of the first work that's demonstrated out into the community. As such, that gives us just a little bit of time here before a lot of earnest development is underway to try and get everybody up to speed, or at least get you introduced so you can join in on those efforts. So we're scheduling these tech talks every Thursday. We're going to alternate times between what right now is 8 a.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Alternate weeks to try to best support a lot of the folks around the globe. So I know it may be unfriendly to those of you who are in the Pacific Coast time right now. Just note that we're trying to provide this early morning hour so that those who are in things like the Japanese region can better attend. We'll also hold them again on Thursday evenings on alternate weeks to better support maybe some of your time frames, and it'll be less friendly to others. We'll talk about that in a second. In fact, I want to kind of do a quick poll about where people are from and dialing in from, so we get a sense of whether or not the times we've indicated so far are going to work for folks. Topics. I've got a list of topics that I think we can go through in each session, but I want to get your feedback as well. Today's session is going to be very, very rudimentary. So for those of you who have already started to get into EdgeX and have already got it up and running, you're going to probably find not a lot in this first 30 minutes are going to be helpful. Maybe during the Q&A we can help you out a little bit. But going beyond today, we want to get deeper into lots of different areas, but I want your direction to help me discuss where it is you would like to see more information or learn more about EdgeX. With that in mind, just kind of a quick poll here this morning as we're getting people on board. And Brett, if you wouldn't mind opening up the microphones, just kind of a quick poll here, trying to understand where folks are coming from. So if you could maybe just shout out where you're located so we can kind of diagram up here on the board largely where folks are coming from.
Boston.
Okay, we've got one.
Spain.
Hi, this is
Austin.
Spain.
Poland.
Michigan.
Taiwan.
United
Serbia.
Kingdom.
Serbia. Yeah.
Somewhere there.
Yeah. Roughly.
United
India.
Kingdom.
United Kingdom.
Indianapolis.
India. Yeah.
Do I have any others? And I know Brett and some are from the West Coast out there. That's great, folks. Thank you very much. It helps to give us a little bit of an indication, too, of where folks are dialing in from. And as you can see, we have global dispersion already with regard to EdgeX. So I will ask that everybody show a little bit of patience. I know some of the times are not going to be perfect for everybody, but I think based on what we're already seeing and hearing, the time frames are probably going to be the best we can do, at least for the immediate future. We'll revisit that as we go, and certainly send us some notes. Either send me a note or send Brett and the folks at Linux Foundation notes about what times you think might work or what venues might work best for you. We'll do our best to try to accommodate. We are recording these sessions as well. And so as we are recording them, even if you aren't able to get up at that early hour or stay up late in the evening, you can always download it and take a look at what's been provided online. And we'll talk about where that's located here coming up in just a bit. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so let's talk about EdgeX. Let's get you up and running. Again, for those of you who are online who have EdgeX up and running, I see my good friend Cloud Sai, who is one of the developers of EdgeX, who's located in Taiwan. He's going to be bored to death here by this next few slides. He's not only been getting things up and running, he's been writing code in EdgeX for some time. So for those of you who are like Cloud, you might want to zone out for just a bit. For those who are just getting started, I'm going to assume you know little or nothing about EdgeX in terms of technology, and I'm also going to try and take baby steps here. So for some of you, maybe a little bit too slow. Again, future sessions we'll try and do a little bit deeper dive and maybe accelerate things. What do you need to get EdgeX up and running? And I'm taking this from a perspective of a developer. We have a set of Dockerized containers that could allow you to get and run EdgeX without ever having to touch a line of code or without ever having to get any kind of development tools in place. We'll cover that in a session, maybe one of our tech talks coming up in the future. So this is assuming you are a developer and assuming that you want to get things up and running. To develop EdgeX today, you're first of all going to need Git or some Git tool to be able to download the code into your local development environment. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to upload code back to Git. That's just dependent on whether or not you have something to contribute. But to get the code, you're going to need access to Git and the tool that will get that for you. You may need Mongo database. We'll talk about that. In fact, I'll show you how to get Mongo up and running and how to get it seeded with the initialization script that we have for EdgeX. If you are running Docker containers, there is an option for you to use the Mongo container that we've built for this project. That will be a future discussion. In other words, I'm not going to cover that today. I'm not going to get into Docker and how to use Docker with regard to EdgeX, but there is an avenue where if you really don't want to set up Mongo in your system, there is a way for us to still have you develop and contribute without having to download Mongo directly. You will need Java JDK. 1.8 or better. The microservices today that we have available are all Java-based. In the future, we'll probably have some other languages. In fact, inside of Dell, our Fuse product was a polyglot development environment. All sorts of programming languages were used. But what we have available today is written in Java, and you will need the JDK, not just the JRE. If you're going to be doing compiling and things of that nature, you're going to need that JDK, so make sure you have that available. You're going to need Eclipse. We recommend a Mars version or better. You could probably get away with a little bit of an older version of Eclipse, but it doesn't take much to download the Mars or a greater version. I think the latest copy is called Neon. So get the latest and greatest. Make sure also that you're downloading what is the JEE version of Eclipse, not just the base Eclipse. Oftentimes that will leave you wanting with regard to some of the tools and plugins that are available. Make sure also that Eclipse knows where your JDK is located through preferences, and we'll talk about that and take a look at that here coming up in some of the demo. You may optionally need Docker and Docker Compose. Again, not going to cover that today, but everything with regard to EdgeX today has been containerized, and you may find that there are pieces that you could run from a Docker perspective that you don't need to actually download the code. In other words, you just want to run maybe one of the microservices and use it, but you don't actually need to go and look at its code or get into its code. There's a way for you to do that. In other words, there's a way for you to kind of operate in a hybrid environment where some of the things you're working with are in your Eclipse environment and some of the things you're working with are in Docker containers. Again, we'll talk more about that in future tech talks, and we'll leave that for a future discussion, but know that that is probably a tool eventually you're going to want to get both Docker and Docker Compose in your environment if you're going to be hot and heavy into EdgeX development. We have developed EdgeX to be platform independent, both hardware and with regard to operating system. So when you ask which operating system do I need to run this in, the answer is it is your choice. We have people operating today and running today in Windows, various forms of Linux, and Mac. So really, as long as you can get the tools that I've just listed and set up in your environment, you are typically good to go. There may be some nuances, especially when you get into things like Docker and Docker Compose, but for base Java type development, which is what EdgeX is today, pretty straightforward. Folks, I am not going to cover today how to install these tools. I'm going to assume that as developers or aspiring developers, you can and or will be able to get these tools set up. If you desperately need help here, please reach out to me, send me an email, send me a message of some sort. I'll try and help you as best I can. There are plenty of great sites out there to help you get involved in getting these set up, but we're going to leave that as kind of an exercise for your work as we go forward. Okay, let's see here.
Jim?
Yep.
Hi, quick question.
Sure.
Can we run these services in Raspberry Pi? By the way, this is Vinay here.
Yeah, great question, Vinay. Yeah, how you doing? The answer is, yeah, the services themselves are platform independent. In fact, we have run all of our services in things like Raspberry Pi or other environments, even things like Arduino in some cases. What you will find, however, is that the Docker containers we have were not compiled for or running in an ARM-based type of technology. In fact, I've had several emails from people who are willing to and looking at actually doing that for us. It's just really hard, at least based on our work here, to keep up with trying to get everything written for each of the chipsets. There's nothing in the code that will prohibit you from doing that, and yes, we have done it in the past. We just don't have that readily available in terms of Docker containers. But if you get the code and work through the process that we'll go through here today, it would not take much for you to get your application running on a Raspberry Pi. Mongo is probably the toughest of those, but you will find there's some people out there who can get you set up as far as even getting a Docker container, for example, that runs Mongo and ARM.
On Raspberry Pi?
On Raspberry Pi, yep.
Okay.
Yep, we have done it. It is possible. We just don't have it readily available in our code set today.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Great question. Okay, so let's get EdgeX. How do we do that? You need to download the project repositories from Git. They are located, as you see here on the screen. Let me highlight that, at the GitHub repository that the Linux Foundation folks have graciously set up for us, github.com, EdgeX Foundry. Be aware, there are many microservices and libraries, and I know that is usually, microservices is a great architecture. I love it. It is very flexible. There is a positive sides to it. The negative side is when you do microservices, there's usually lots of little pieces, lots of little Legos out there. So be aware that there are many microservices, and as we visit the GitHub site here in just a bit, you will see that there are lots and lots of packages out there. So you need to understand the landscape a little bit. And so that's why we kind of have some diagrams out there that will dictate or indicate to you what some of the dependencies are. And I think after today's session, hopefully you're going to get a much better appreciation of what's out there, how some of those relate. You won't have a total picture yet. You'll learn more as you go, but we'll get you up and running on the basics and what you need to think about downloading right away. So let's in fact do that. So give me a second here, folks, and see if I can get out of this and pop over to a browser here. Okay, so oops, let me clear the screen. So I'm at the GitHub site for EdgeX, and as I mentioned, lots and lots of various repositories and or libraries that are out there. In fact, a couple pages worth. I think we're up to something like 20 some various projects out there to date. And there are going to be many more. We're already working to try and provide some of the device services and additional code that Dell worked on into the open source environment, so there's going to be more. One thing I will advocate to you is if you see, and let me kind of spin down here towards the bottom part of it to pick up one. Yeah, if you see one that is labeled something like this, Docker dash whatever, for right now, if you're just getting up and running, ignore those particular repositories. Those are the repositories that help us get the particular microservices into a Docker container, more for build sake and build processes, if you will. If you're into Docker and want to start to investigate that, by all means do so, but for the beginner, not something you need to worry about right away. You also see this project called CI Management. That is our Jenkins job builders that the folks in Linux Foundation are helping us get set up. So that's what's doing the builds in the background for our various artifacts. You will not need that as well unless you join hardcore development build processes inside the EdgeX Foundry project. You won't need to get into those as well. Everything else, though, is fair game, and you will notice of particular, and I like the fact that it just happens to show up first in our list, the developer scripts. That is not a microservice nor a library, but there are a couple things in there, as we'll see, that will really help you maybe shortcut in getting things like the database set up. Okay, so that's where the code is. How do you actually go and download it? Well, that's where you need a Git tool, as I mentioned. In this case, I've got my little Git bash screen up, and I've already taken liberty this morning of downloading a number of the various services. And I'll go back in just a second and have a screenshot and a slide that'll talk about the libraries and the services you need to download. But just to kind of give you an example about how this works, if you've never used Git before, you want to do a little bit of training on that. You want to get into how Git works. But once we've got Git in our environment, we want to download most of those repositories. Again, you don't need to worry about the Docker ones. That's usually done as a fairly simple command line execution. In this case, git clone, and then the name of the particular repository that you're interested. In this case, I'm going to download, for example, I'm going to download the core command, which is not one that's in my list right now. So I'm going to ask to download that particular repository. And as you can see here, if you've got a nice little spiffy Dell machine like I've got, comes down pretty quickly. So downloading each of the repositories is a fairly quick exercise once you understand how to get yourself around the Git environment and you understand the naming nomenclature around how the repositories are set up in that GitHub account. By the way, too, if you're wondering where did I get the name core command or where did I get this github.com EdgeX Foundry information, if you go to any one of the particular repositories that you're interested in, for example, I just downloaded this core command. If you click on that particular repository, you'll notice there's a clone or download button that will give you that whole URL and the whole name. You can use that to copy and paste that right into the Git shell to actually execute that request to clone that data into your local environment. Okay, let's head back here. So which of the libraries do I need? like I mentioned, there are a ton of libraries, ton of microservices out there. I've listed these in the order that I would start to download them. And these are in the order, as we'll see here coming up in just a bit, that you want to also build with. The idea here is that EdgeX does have some libraries that are shared libraries. For example, let me get my drawing tool back up here. The core domain, core test, and core exception are all libraries that are used by many of the core services. Support domain is a library used by many of the support microservices. So you want to get these repositories pretty much in this order. Now, one of the things you can do is you can stop when you've gotten all of the code necessary to get you to the point where you need to work on a particular microservice. For example, maybe you're going to be working in something like the core metadata microservice. Well, you need to download then everything to the point to where you get to core metadata, but you certainly don't need things lower in the list like export domain and export client if you're working on core metadata. If you're working on the whole system, yep, sorry to say, this whole list is what you need to download. As we like to say in our office, time to download the world. So download what you need based on what you're going to work in, and try to stick, as this list provides, try to stick to this list as kind of an order sequence of what it is you need to download from the GitHub repository. As I mentioned lastly too, again, ignore those Docker versions right now. You do not need those. Questions on that? I'm not sure if the microphones are open or not. It sounded like from Vinay's question it was. Anybody have any questions so far?
Sorry, let me unmute everyone.
Oh, thanks, Brett.
And there's 2 questions in the chat window as well.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find where a lot of the background noise is. I'll cut that out.
Okay, thank you. Let me see here if I can find the chat window. Go ahead, somebody has a question.
I have a question here on audio.
Go ahead.
Will there be a copy of these slides available afterwards, since they're rich with information and it's hard to sort of transcribe them into notes?
Excellent leading question. These slides are already available on the Wiki website.
The way it played out was I touched base with some of the other
folks, we do have a lot of background noise.
Hey, we've seen this technology
so
before.
I'm going to ask Brett to mute everybody again. Let's do this. At the end of the session, I'll open up for more Q&A if we have to. We'll backtrack to the slides and cover that. But to the gentleman's question about are these slides available, great leading question. Let me answer that right away and actually take you out there to that website. So let's see here. Bring this back. Indeed, we have a wiki, and that information is going to be made available in a second. Sounds like a very serious problem out there. Again, folks, if you can mute your lines while we're in session here, it will help with background noise. To the gentleman's question, though, about are these slides available? Is the information going to be available? You will notice in our wiki site, which can be found at wiki.edgexfoundry.org, that there is this EdgeX Tech Talk area. And in that area, you will see already listed under the meeting minutes the presentations for today's session on June 29th. And I'm assuming too, Brett is going to make available the video of this, and I'm not sure it'll be placed in the same area, but it will be made available in the wiki area as well out there. So great leading question. Lots more information on the wiki too, folks. We'll talk about that as a resource for you to use coming up here in just a bit. Okay, back to the presentation again. We'll cover some of your questions. It sounds like we've got quite a bit of noise in the background there. We'll cover some of your questions here coming up as we get into the Q&A area. So let me try and get through this material here, and then we'll get to those questions and answers. So as I mentioned, folks, you've got lots of libraries, lots of pieces and parts that need to be downloaded to start to develop EdgeX out there. This is our wonderful architectural diagram that lists all the microservices that are available in the EdgeX environment. For example, I just downloaded the core command microservice. But again, this picture doesn't show you where some of the libraries are. So I've added those and added to this diagram where those particular libraries apply. For example, the core libraries here obviously apply to core services, where the export libraries apply into the export services area. This picture kind of augments, if you will, the diagram I had, or I should say the slide I had up previously, which was one that gave you a listing of all of the various microservices and libraries. So this one will kind of give you the visual of how each of these services are laid out and how they relate in terms of what libraries are associated with services. There are some great diagrams as well. As I mentioned in a previous slide, we have some diagrams on the wiki which will give you the dependencies. In other words, which microservices are really dependent on others and which microservices are dependent on some of those libraries out there. So you'll find that in the wiki site as well if you need some additional help. Okay, so let's talk about then, once you've got the code and you've gone to Git and you've downloaded those microservices and the libraries, the next thing you're going to need to do is set up the database. Again, we are using Mongo currently as the database implementation, NoSQL implementation for storing the data coming in from sensors and devices into EdgeX. We have provided in the developer script repo initialization scripts to both get your environment up and running and also get the database initialized. So let me take you out to how this works. In fact, what you're going to want to look at is there a script out there called init-mongo.js in that developer script area. That Mongo JavaScript is what sets up each of the databases and also sets up the authentication if you want to have security turned on for your Mongo database in the Mongo environment, so that when you run EdgeX, you can actually run it so that things like the container data that's in there is not easily accessible. It's going to have to require access and authentication. Alternately, again, and not covered by today's class, you could run Mongo in a Docker container, in which case you wouldn't need to worry about this setup of the database. You would need to get the Mongo container that already has the EdgeX initialization done in it. Again, that'll be a topic for another Tech Talk coming up soon. So let me take you out there and quickly kind of give you an indication about how setting up Mongo works in our particular environment. So let me bring in a little prompt here. I'm obviously running here in Windows. The same thing can be done in a Linux environment. The only thing that I will mention is that the scripts that we've got available out there today are batch scripts, so they are Windows specified. A neat job for somebody who may be Linux aficionado. That might be a way to get started in contributing to EdgeX here and developing some scripts that are shell-based or something of that nature. It wouldn't be hard to do. We've got a script out there, as you can see by the listing in the developer scripts repository on my system. We've got a script out there that says start db.bat and startdb no authorization.bat. Those are two scripts that assume that that Mongo is installed in your Windows environment per the kind of the standard default settings. I'm going to start up the database by asking to start, and I'm going to start in this case without authentication. You probably want to do that to get things started. Once you start to become more aware about how EdgeX works, then you may want to deal with authentication and how that has to be handled also from a code perspective. But I'm going to start the database up with no authentication, and as you can see, it starts up a Mongo prompt. You don't want to shut this down. This is your database, so I'm just going to minimize that. So now the database is up and running, but you do need to also initialize the database with things like the document stores that are necessary for EdgeX. There's a script in there, as I mentioned, and if I do a more on init Mongo JS, you'll see the script is quite lengthy. It's a script to, again, get things like the documents stores that are necessary for Mongo for EdgeX in place. It also sets up things like the administrative passwords and authentication access for the various containers and documents out there once you do decide to use authentication and access. Now, we have provided as well, clear the screen there, we have provided as well as part of our script set here, not just that Mongo JavaScript that would get everything initialized, but we actually provided a little shell script that would actually kick off the Mongo shell and run that initialization script. That's in this little file called initshell.bat. What that does, and I'll just more of that really quickly here so you can take a look at it. It's nothing very complicated. It is simply a script that will run the Mongo shell executable and pass in the Mongo JavaScript to get everything initialized. So I'll do that work right now. And you'll see it runs through and successfully creates all of the documents and things that are necessary inside of that Mongo environment. With that, Mongo is ready to run and be used in our EdgeX environment. Okay, so now we've gotten Git. We've gone ahead and we have gotten the database set up through what is available in one of the repositories called developer scripts. What's next? now it's time to bring the code into our EdgeX environment. We are using Eclipse as part of our project. In the future, we might have something like IntelliJ and or other development environments that are used, but that's what we're using today as part of the Dell development team, and what I would encourage you to use until the community starts to embrace and help us in setting things up for other environments. All of the EdgeX microservices and libraries today are written as Java Maven projects, and that's how they're stored out there in the GitHub repository. The only exception to that is the device SDK tools. This is just a standard Java project. The device SDK tools is not a microservice. It is an SDK, as the name implies, that helps you build device services. A lot of information in that last sentence I just mentioned. Again, one of the topics we'll have coming up is how you use that SDK to actually produce device services. What is a device service? Lots more information needed to kind of get your way into that. But for now, just recognize that except for that particular device SDK tools, everything is a Java Maven project. So you need to import those Maven projects into Eclipse, and after you import them, highly recommend you then do a Maven install of that project to get all the libraries pulled in that are being used by those libraries or projects, and to actually build the artifact for that particular project. In other words, build a jar file. When I say pull in all the artifacts, our microservices, our libraries use a lot of other open source code out there. So it's not just about getting the code, you also need to drag in or bring into your environment all the other open source projects that our code uses. That's what the Maven install will actually do for you, and we'll see that here in just a second. Again, you want to do the import into Eclipse and the build of, or the Maven install of, those projects in the order that I presented to you a couple of slides back, again, in this order. If you don't do them in this order, it may find that certain things are not available yet, or you're going to be missing or lacking libraries. So you want to try to build your projects and bring your projects into the Eclipse environment in the order I've listed here. Again, stop whenever you've got what you need, but try to do these in the order listed. So let's take a look at how that operates. Let me bring up my Eclipse environment here. And I know Eclipse is famous for tiny print, so I'm going to be zooming in to certain areas of the screen here so you can get a chance to see things as they're going on. I've already taken liberty again to bring into the environment lots of the libraries, lots of the projects that are already part of EdgeX to kind of speed things along here this morning. But again, if we wanted to take a look at any one of these particular libraries or bring in any one of the particular microservice projects, we do that with a file import. And let me zoom in there if I can on that, so you can see on the Eclipse menu, file, import. And then once I choose the import option, I want to do a Maven, existing Maven projects in the import window. So that's what I want to choose. So do an import of existing Maven projects. Click the next button. And let's go ahead and I'm going to actually go to the directory where I have all of my repositories downloaded from Git, and you'll notice it actually recognized that core command, one of the ones that I have available but haven't yet imported, is already listed as something I might want to import. So I'll go ahead and do that. Let me finish and import that. Let's zoom back out here, folks. Okay, and that quickly, it brought in core command. Maybe if you were fast enough or sharp enough with the eye, you might have saw on Eclipse how it was doing a quick import and build of that project. Again, it's building the code, compiling the code, but I would recommend you then do an install once you bring this project in place. Meaning, right-click on that project, do a run as Maven install. That again will force the environment here, force Eclipse to go out, bring in all the necessary open source jar files that we're using. You can see there it brought in some of the additional jar files. It'll then work its way through the unit tests that are compatible for that particular microservice, and then build the microservice and dump the jar file out into your local Maven repository. So all that happens fairly quickly. The problem is, obviously, there are just a lot of microservices, a lot of libraries you need to do that with. So do that one at a time with each one and do them in the order that I listed in that slide deck. The last thing we have to really cover then is once we've got everything in our environment, we now need to go ahead and bring up and actually run EdgeX. So how do we do that? Well, again, there's kind of a minimum set of EdgeX microservices that can get you functional and actually see data coming in from a virtual device service pretty quickly. One problem we do have, though, is there was a small mistake in our virtual device service that I need to kind of correct with you here quickly. It'll be fixed in the next build. But one thing you will see is there's going to be one error in the device service, the virtual device service that we have out there. In fact, to begin with, I forgot I need to also bring that particular library into our environment. So another example here of how to bring in one of the repositories. Let me go out and get the virtual device service, I guess I should say. The virtual device service is a device service that mimics a sensor or device. It's not a real sensor device, but it mimics it through software. So let me bring that now into our Eclipse environment. So you get another chance to see how to import again. So import existing Maven project. And in this case, let me go back to this. It lists device virtual. And let me import that. Okay, now when you do import the virtual device, as I mentioned, this is going to be the one place you'll see so far in our code. I'm sure there'll be others in the future, but right now the one place in our code which does have a boo-boo in it. And so go ahead, when it brings up this error in the import, just go ahead and finish that and say, yep, that's fine, I understand. Actually, I'll just cancel that. I understand that there's a problem there, and it will list the virtual device. Let me zoom in on that for you with this little red X indicating there's an issue, and in particular, there's an issue with the POM file. So I'm going to zoom back out. Open up that POM file, and in order to correct that problem until we get that into our current build, the only thing that's missing right now is, and I'll take you down here to the place where it has to go, is around the plugins. There needs to be a plugin management element. So simply enter that element in place and put the end tag around the plugins. Save that file, and magically after the build of the workspace in place there, it will make that problem magically go away. So a small boo-boo that is currently in our device, virtual device code that we're getting fixed. In fact, it's already fixed. We're just got to merge that in with the code we have out in place. So the next few days that should be taken care of. Let me build that, as I said, with each one of our projects. So let me go ahead and run that as a Maven install. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I've brought into our environment a fair number of the microservices and all the libraries necessary to build those microservices into Eclipse. Once we've got that up and running, you want to run something. You want to see something run, and you want to make sure that you've got your EdgeX environment set up correctly. How do you do that? Well, it really only requires a few minimal set of microservices to get something up and running in EdgeX. You need core metadata, you need core data, and you need this virtual device service we call device virtual. That along with having the database up and running. So make sure your database is running before you try to run EdgeX in Eclipse. You may also, as you bring this environment in, want to change some of the configuration. In particular, you're going to want to change the service name for the virtual device service, and I'll show you that in a second. And you may want to do things like change some of the configuration log levels so you can see more about what's happening inside of EdgeX. So again, to get a minimal environment up and running, you need core data, you need metadata, and you need this device virtual service along with the database. So let's go see how to get this environment running now in my Eclipse environment. As I mentioned, once you bring in the device service, you may want to start to check out, as with all of the microservices, you may want to check out the configuration that's held in a file called application properties. And in particular, you may want to do things like change the logging level. We've got it set up by default to be info. You may want to change that, to example, to be debug, so you get more information out of what comes through the services as they exercise. In particular, too, you're going to want to change the actual service name and the service host name to be the name of your particular system. There's a reason for that. We've set up all of our systems for containerization, and they're expecting them to run in a container that has an environment name. So just name the service name and service host for the device virtual to your computer name, in this case, my GIMS XPS system. I'm going to save that. And now let's go and run those three microservices that I indicated. I'm going to start with core metadata. So again, let me zoom in. I want to start with core metadata. I want to right-click on that particular microservice, and I want to say to do a run as, and I'm going to have to zoom back out to be able to get down to that menu item, run as a Java application. When you do that, you should see the console window come up in just a second, and you get to choose which particular of the classes that you want to run in that particular environment. In this case, you're always looking for the application class of that microservice. So in this case, org EdgeX Foundry application. And then the console will start to display as it logs the system coming up, any particular information it has to offer about what's going on. You'll notice that it's indicating that it is the metadata microservice that's running. That's going to be important as you've got lots of microservices that could be running out there. Sometimes it's tough to see what's running where. And lastly, it will dispense this little log item that says the metadata microservices is now up and running when you see this message that this is the whichever microservice. Let's do the same thing with regard to core data. The second one of these microservices that we want to get up and running. Again, you do a run as Java application, pick the application class for that particular microservice, and then within a couple of seconds, it should come up in your environment. My XPS system is fairly beefy. If you're running on a little bit of a less system, it may come up a little bit slower, but not too terribly bad. And there again, you see that in this case, I've selected to run core data, and that's output in the console window, and I'm waiting to see that this is the core data microservice to know that it's up and running. So I've now got two of those microservices running that I indicated. The last one is let's get the device virtual service up and running. So run as Java application. Going to pick again the application class. This one found in org EdgeX Foundry device virtual. Now I did ask for the device virtual microservice to print out more in terms of its statements and debugging. I asked for it to do a debug version of output. So going to get a little bit more information here from this particular service. And this one does take a little bit longer to get set up. It's got to do a lot of work in getting these virtual devices set up. It's got to do a lot of work to register in with metadata. And then it's got to start to ship information to the core data service in terms of sensing or device data, if you will. So it will take a little bit more time to get this one up and running. And I think we're now in business. If I take a look, go back here to that service. Yep, I think we are up and running. Let me check and make sure it's got that one message. There it is. Yep, this is the virtual device microservice. So now those three minimally required microservices to see something running in EdgeX are up and running. How do I know that something is running with regard to that environment? Well, to check that it's working, you can do a couple things. First of all, check again the logs, make sure it says that this is the whatever microservice. If it doesn't say that, then you probably have some sort of error in the log, and that'll start to give you information about what's happening. You can then ping any one of these microservices. There's an API document out there in the wiki site which will give you the ping address for each microservice. I just happen to know that the 48080 address or port number is the one for core data. So if I bring up my favorite browser again, if I go out and I ask to ping, and I'll zoom in on this here as soon as I get it up and running there, folks. If I go out there and I ping at that localhost 48080 API version 1 ping address, you'll see it responds with Pong. Any one of the services can be checked that way. So for example, metadata operates on port 48081. So I can ping that service and get back again a similar Pong response. So that's one quick way to check that the actual microservices are indeed functioning and running out there. Other ways that you can now also check that things are running, you want to actually see data. One of the ways to start to do that is see the data being produced by that virtual device coming through core data. I'm going to do that with a call to the core data service and asking for the event count. So let me go back to that same browser. And on the metadata API, I'll ask for the event count. This is the count of the number of events that are being produced or have been produced so far by the device service into core data. And if you're not sure exactly what does an event mean, that is essentially an object which represents a reading that's been taken, in this case by the virtual device service, and passed up into core data and then persisted in the actual Mongo database. A lot more details will be provided about those specifics and how things like the core data works underneath the covers and how device virtual services work and pass their data up. We'll cover those topics in upcoming Tech Talks. Okay, with that, let me zoom back out. I think we have pretty much reached the end of our discussion about how to get EdgeX up and running and how to see things running in your environment. Lots more information out there, gang. I know this was a quick spill this morning, and I've actually overrun my 30-minute time, and I want to provide a chance for some question and answer here. But there are lots of other resources out there to start to get you into more details about EdgeX. Our wiki site, certainly. We've got a Rocket Chat set up that allows you to ask questions and post issues out there. Our website, our GitHub site, and again, my email address for any additional information you might need. I think with that, we want to talk about what topics you may want to cover here, questions you have about what you saw today, but then I also want to open it up for additional questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave kind of our resource page up here so you can copy down any of those addresses that you need. And I'm going to ask Brett to go ahead and open up the microphones. And folks, again, please, if you can, mute yourself, mute your line if you're not speaking so that the rest of the community can get their question in. And let's open up and see what questions you might have and if you have any suggestions about future topics.
And Jim, just before we open up, there were a couple questions that came through over the chat window
Sure.
we might be able to address. And also at the footer of the chat window, I just put in the email address for the developers mail list as an alternate path for more development questions.
Excellent. Okay. Let me see if I can bring up the chat window here. Okay, let's see. So got the question, I think, already on the Raspberry Pi. Maybe we should consider using repo, which helps manage a large number of Git repository. Certainly an option there, folks. Again, this is now an open source effort. So if you have ideas about how we can improve, and more importantly, you are able to contribute and do some of that work, we would be very, very grateful for that. So please, if you have some ideas about how to improve the environment, we may get to it on our own, but it'll be more quickly addressed if you can help. What's the difference between EXF device and a consumer gateway like Wink or SmartThings? So EdgeX is a software platform that could run on just about any type of a device, include, for example, our Dell Gateway is going to be running EdgeX someday. Wink and some of these other products that you mentioned, folks, there is a lot of hardware out there that is being used both in consumer as well as in the industrial spaces for collecting sensor and device data. The hardware itself may be just that, if you will, kind of like a router for the data. You typically need on top of that some sort of software platform to help ingest the data and do something with that data. That's what EdgeX is all about. It has to run on hardware or it has to run on some sort of platform, but it itself is not going to be the actual hardware like a gateway or something like a Wink product that serves kind of as a router to get that information in. Let's see, what else do we have here in terms of questions? Can you describe what was the motivation for selecting MongoDB? Great question, and one that would take us a fair amount of time. Let me just suffice it to say, gang, there, and if anybody has questions more on that, please post a question on Rocket Chat or send me an email and I'll get into more details. But the bottom line was, when we first looked at the need for a database and persistence with regard to EdgeX, we were looking, first of all, for NoSQL, because we knew things like speed and performance were going to be an issue, and we needed to have something that was a little bit more flexible and not as rigid in terms of documents and storing readings and things of that nature. We looked at what was very popular at the time. We started this project 2 years ago, and Mongo was one of the more popular, if not still one of the most popular NoSQL databases. And if you're familiar with the CAP theorem, we looked at the CAP theorem at the time and looked at what were the edges of the three spaces of the CAP theorem that seemed to apply most to our environment. Knowing what we know today, I think some of the consistency, which we were really looking at first, may not apply as much as we first thought and could probably be relooked. Something like Cassandra as a database we're very interested in today. But take heart and take note in that what we did with regard to EdgeX can very easily replace that database pretty quickly. In fact, we've actually done that on occasion at Dell. We actually replaced the Mongo database with a SQLite database over about a week's period without any changes to any other services and core data. So while Mongo was selected for various reasons, and I can get into more details, we are looking as we go forward for options about, well, are there other persistence mechanisms we need? And can the community help provide those kinds of core data wrappers around that database very easily that can make for a plug and play microservice there that supports lots of other endeavors? So good question. And the bottom line is the database is important, but not that important. It can be easily replaced. Brett's got the list for the tech talks out there. Thanks, Brett. Let's see. What projects are related to device services? Today we have just the SDK out there, which helps create your own device service, and we have the virtual device service. But stay tuned to the Rocket Channel gang. Dell is working to open source a large number of the device services that we create internally. The only reason we did not open source those right away is when you get to the things like devices and sensors, there are some libraries that we have to use that we had to make sure were going to be compatible with the Apache 2 license, which is EdgeX. We did not want to taint the open source environment or the license agreement by bringing in a microservice that was not in compliance there. So we're going to have probably about a half a dozen device services around things like Modbus, BACnet, and BLE very shortly. But then the device service SDK helps you to produce your own. And I know there are a lot of people on this call are actually helping to think about that and which device services they want to add. Let's see. Eclipse Neon has auto build configured by default. Does this handle the Maven install? In fact, almost every Eclipse environment has that auto build on by default. And no, that does not address the Maven install. It will build the project when it brings the Maven project into your environment. In other words, it will compile the code, but it will not push all the artifacts and the included artifacts, the dependency artifacts, into your local repository. So if you do not do your own Maven install, all you're doing is compiling the code. You're not actually producing artifacts and or pulling down artifacts that the EdgeX environment needs. So make sure you do that Maven install. Is EdgeX or Fuse deployed in the real-world scenarios today? EdgeX is not yet deployed to any real-world scenario. Fuse has been used in a couple of pilot projects, but nothing that is in documented well out there. And again, those were pretty much pilot projects for our internal purposes to kind of validate some use cases. So we are very much excited about trying to get EdgeX put together and kind of we're not calling it a beta release, but we're calling it the Barcelona release for the October timeframe that is going to be meant to kind of be proving out the APIs and making sure we've got things generally correct from a community perspective. And then at that point, we will launch into a more industrial strength productization, making sure that we build into it all of the necessary test cases, making sure we build into it kind of the exception handling and all the necessary goods to make it really product ready. And we're hoping that'll happen sometime in the early 2018 timeframe. At least that's our hope today. I'd like to write a device service, but not in Java. What should I be aware of? You want to learn the APIs of EdgeX. Today we have written the device service SDK in Java. There is hope and intention to provide SDKs in other languages. We're not there yet, and volunteers greatly accepted. For those, though, who want to write a device service in another language, the SDK and the device services that we already have or will have out there shortly provide you an indication of how to use the APIs around the rest of EdgeX. And that's what you need to be able to do, is you can write a diverse device service in something like C or Go and still have it communicate with the APIs of the other services to, for example, get data into core data and receive commands from the rest of the system. While a lot of that may seem like foreign talk to folks at this point because you haven't gotten into the system, I would encourage everybody, as you start to explore the code, explore the API set. That's what's really important right now. And that's what allows any microservice to be completely independent and written in a different language from any other particular microservice to include these device services. So if you're looking to do that, bottom line is take a look at what the SDK does, even if you're not a Java developer, know what it does and know how to translate that into a different language in a device service that's written in something other than Java today. And what's the ETA for releasing the other device services? Folks, it's in the hand of lawyers right now. We did our work in our development team of getting those device services cleaned up, namespace changed from Fuse, EdgeX. It is in the hands of the lawyers, and we're expecting that to be probably in the next couple of weeks to get done. Which microservice is responsible for resource allocation and scheduling? There is a scheduling microservice out there, but metadata holds the data about schedules. And so the scheduling microservice really is one that can be used to facilitate the kickoff of anything and resource allocation if you need to, but each microservice really can do a lot of that work on its own and simply go to metadata for data about what its schedule should be. In fact, that's what the device virtual service does today. It stores scheduling information about how often it wants to kick out data in the metadata scheduling database or collection, and then it triggers its own internal activity. There is a scheduling service. Feel free to look at that API and look at how it can be used to also kick off and schedule work. It's a matter of whether you want to make that kind of as an independent feature of your microservice, or if you want to take advantage of some of the existing microservice technology that's out there. I think I have exhausted the questions in chat. We still have a few minutes left here. Are there other questions that folks might have online? Another question comes in here about do we have any kind of service discovery? Built into the device SDK and built into the existing device services, we do have a concept of discovery. There is a scaffolding inside of the device services for how to discover a new device of that type for each device service. That is code that you would have to write for your particular device service. As everybody knows, the protocols and devices are very different. So how you discover a BLE device versus how you discover a new Modbus device would be very, very different. The scaffolding is there. And examples are there provided with the services that we're going to be releasing, as well as with the device virtual service. But that is code that as you look going forward, discovery is going to be something we're putting, at least today, the responsibility into the device service provider to figure out if and or how discovery is going to be accomplished by that particular device service. Let's see, from the roadmap items, there are there any order of priority in terms of what's going to be accomplished? For that, folks, I'm going to encourage everybody to sign up for things like the TSC meetings. The Technical Steering Committee now owns EdgeX in terms of where we're going and how we're getting there. Your contributions and comments with regard to the direction set are certainly welcome. But in terms of that roadmap, it was an early roadmap set that we at Dell kind of provided, but the TSC is now going to take that and working with the community, determine where we go next. There are some top priority items about making things production ready, but with regard to anything else, almost everything is on the table. It's about where you, the community, want to take this product. Any other questions? Either Brett has you all on mute, or we have exhausted the questions.
Yeah, everyone is muted. Go ahead.
Is there a way to run a part of the services on one device and the other part on another so that they can communicate?
Yeah, great question. Great question. In fact, let me pop out of here real quickly. The answer is absolutely. EdgeX was built to be completely distributed. And as an indication of that, if you go into any one of the device services, and I'll kind of zoom in on that with my screen here, you're going to see this REST endpoints properties file. And I'll open that up, for example, for this device virtual service, just so you can get a sense. And there are quite a few addresses there. And what those are the addresses for the various capabilities that any one service needs to reach out and communicate with. And as you can see, that's completely configurable. So you could have metadata running on an entirely different box and have all the other services be able to reach that. And as you start to learn about EdgeX as well, we actually have a configuration registry, where that configuration information and a registration of all the services that are available is made publicly available to all the microservices. In other words, it could be more dynamic as opposed to being a static address, as you see here in this REST endpoints properties file. In fact, when we bring things up in a total environment, that registry and configuration service is the first thing in any microservice has to go to. It signs in with that particular registry, and it pulls down configuration information, which overrides the local properties file for any service. So in this case, it would override, for example, all these REST endpoints. And that's how you can make for some dynamic allocation of where particular services exist on, say, a larger network. Obviously, we at Dell are going to plan to use EdgeX on our gateway, so it would all be running on that same box. But we absolutely made this an environment that can operate from every part of what is more generally called today the fog, from edge all the way to cloud, and operate independently that way. Great question.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for answering. Just follow up if I understood correctly. You said about the registry for dynamic allocation. It's available now or will be?
That is one of the services that is already available. If you take a look out there, there is a configuration service. We wrapped essentially a console product. In fact, my good friend Cloud, who's online, is the author of that particular service. So the capability is already out there. I encourage you to read the service documentation in the wiki, and we'll have that also probably be one of our tech talk topics. That's a tongue twister coming up in the near future. Other questions? And folks, we have reached a little bit after 9 o'clock here. Because I went over today, I'm happy to stay on just a little bit longer. But for those who need to drop off, certainly thank you very much for your time. We're going to keep based on what we saw today, I think we're going to keep our time listing as we have. We'll again revisit that as necessary, but it'll be every Thursday, alternating between 9 a.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Is that correct? 6 p.m. Eastern Time, if I've got that correct, Brett. And next week we'll be doing it at 9 a.m. again, just because of a schedule conflict. Any other questions? And stay around for a couple of minutes to address those.
I think there was one new one in the chat window as well.
One new one in the chat. Okay. Let's see. Are you focusing only on industrial? Are you eyeing healthcare, smartphones later down the line? Certainly Dell's perspective, Dell's need for EdgeX was industrial IoT based, but we absolutely believe and we absolutely hope that EdgeX will be used throughout a lot of IoT environments. There are a number of organizations, some of you part of, that are from organizations that are approaching this more from a consumer standpoint. One of the things that we're focusing in on first are what we call more of the forgiving use cases. So for example, we're dealing with the things like your heating and cooling systems as kind of a major use case to address. Things like healthcare systems as identified here, especially those where maybe I'm going to be operating your heart system. Those are ones that are not as forgiving, right? We need to make sure that EdgeX is extremely hardened for those kind of environments. That's not to say we don't think that EdgeX has potential applicability in those environments. They may need some re-architecting in certain areas to support, but we are not nearly ready for some of those hard real-time and life-threatening types of situations. In other words, I would not want EdgeX to yet operate my airbag of my car. But someday, with the work of all of you and the help of all of you in the community, we hope to get there. So industrial IoT has kind of been our focus. Branching out into consumer IoT is probably coming with a number of the folks in the community, and we'll go from there based on where you all tell us to go. Brett, the line is still open. Do we have any other questions?
I was actually being more cautious of the unmute all.
Okay, sure.
Some people actually prefer to be on mute, but
Sure.
If anyone has any issues getting off mute, just shoot a message over the chat. Jim, before everyone leaves, the best option if they have topics they'd like covered, would that be your email and/or Rocket?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to identify that. Thanks very much, Brett. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, folks, especially for future topics, I've got a number of topics that I've started to think about and might suggest. In fact, I think probably talking about Docker, deep diving into each microservice, looking at the SDK, all things that I have kind of on the slate. But if you have ideas about where you'd like to go next in terms of this Thursday session, please send me either an email. You can send that directly to me, or again, a Rocket Chat. And we're trying to stay active out there on the Rocket Chat, gang. I know it might take me a few hours sometimes to get to you, but if you would, post into the Rocket Chat, hey, Jim, we'd like to know more about whatever the case might be, and we'll put that on the agenda. Well, fantastic, folks. I think we've probably exhausted those who are staying up late or those who had to get up early, and it's probably time for caffeine for a number of people at this point, including myself. I want to thank everybody, and I really want to thank you not just for attending today's session, but I am very, very hopeful that we get a chance to see and work with each of you in this community. We're very, very excited about this product and its potential. We think there's a huge need, and we are excited about addressing that need with all of you. So I'm going to wrap things up unless there was any last, I'll check one last second to see if there's any last chat that came in. I don't see any. So with that, I think we'll probably end this session, gang, and we'll talk to you all again next Thursday. Thank you.